Our next presenter is François Guismet, who's a reader in modern Jewish history at University College London.
So what I propose to do now is following up very nicely on David Enger's very ambitious and far-reaching attempt to propose a reflection on how terms for anti-Jewish violence or exclusionary violence emerge and how they apply or do not apply, and what is involved in these processes of use and reuse or application of terms. And my talk is more a reflection or an intervention rather than a defined research program, and was triggered by the numerous commemorative events on the occasion of the 75th anniversary of the Reichskristallnacht, or the Night of Crystals in Berlin, obviously taking place on 9th November 1938, in November 2013. I had been aware, obviously, of the tendency to avoid this popular designation of the violent onslaught on the German Jewish population organized by the Nazi regime, deemed too euphemistic, and this idea that we cannot speak of Kristallnacht, but that we have to find another term because this term doesn't apply, emerged somewhere in the 1980s. I was surprised, however, to which degree it had been replaced almost without exception by the term Pogromnacht, or Night of Pogroms, or November Pogrom. This holds true for both the public sphere, where the commemorative events were often headlined using this term, as well as in academic discourse. For the latter, a large number of examples could be cited. So, for example, a whole special issue of Zeitschrift für Geschichtswissenschaft was entitled Der November Pogrom 1938, the November Pogrom 1938 in German culture of memory. A significant broadening of the application of the term of pogrom is proposed by Raphael Gross and others, but Raphael Gross in a very prominent way, in his very succinct and short study, November 1938, Die Katastrophe vor der Katastrophe, November 1938, the catastrophe before the catastrophe, which contextualizes the events of 10th November 1938 in a general worsening of Jewish-non-Jewish relations during the Nazi regime by putting them very interestingly in the plural. So the November pogroms. As is well known, the term Kristallnacht emerged in Berlin among the populace and seemed at the time an apt metaphorical description of the reflections of shattered glass on the sidewalks in Berlin after the events, after the destruction of shops owned by Jews. It indeed is a term which is far from the cruel reality of events of that night, during which the quasi-totality, and I will demonstrate this, of Jewish places of worship in Nazi Germany were destroyed, Jewish property vandalized or robbed, and thousands of Jews arrested or hurt, and hundreds killed. The question which I would like to ask in this intervention is whether indeed the term pogrom, which is the topic of our conference, seems the most appropriate alternative to Kristallnacht, which I do not believe. In the first step, I would like to reflect on anti-Jewish violence in the 19th century, Eastern Europe, where the term emerges. But I'm afraid there's a very strong reduplication of efforts here, so I will try to shorten this part of my talk. Appear when the term of pogrom gained currency, first in Russian and then in other languages. Then I would like to demonstrate by the use of two set of maps the sharp differences between the events in Eastern Europe before World War I, which seems an important watershed, or we can discuss whether or not 1903 and 1956 is this watershed, and the events in Nazi Germany and in November 1938. And I was not aware to which degree Kani's talk just a minute ago is an illustration of my argument, because I think what takes place in Europe in the interwar period is a new quality of exclusionary violence, and my argument or my appeal to the colleagues is that it is totally wrong and misleading to use the term of pogrom for these events. my own involvement in research on anti-Jewish violence or pogroms in Eastern Europe goes back to my predecessor at University College London, John Clear, whose last monograph I edited together with Dr. Lars Fischer and Helen Clear, because John had passed away without being able to complete his last monograph, which is an authoritative study about the wave of pogroms in Tsarist Russia and in 1881-82. And I will sum up his description of what a pogrom is. Several factors justify a description of the events of 1881-2 as Russia's first modern pogroms. First, they were essentially an urban phenomenon, despite many minor rural episodes, and can be usefully compared with other outbreaks of rioting in a Russian state undergoing urbanization. Second, unlike early events in Odessa, which might be considered proto-pogroms, they were a mass phenomenon that spread in waves through modern means of communication, the railroads, the telegraph, and most of all, the printing press. The latter provided the newspapers, official broadsides, and printed decrees that expedited the spread of the misinformation and rumor that played such an important role in sparking pogroms. Most importantly, these factors established the idea of the anti-Jewish pogrom in the popular mind, creating a precedent and model for future riots. And I would like to give you one short citation from 1871, how a, so to speak, pre-modern, anti-Jewish riot, which would not be mass-based, which would not correspond entirely to this model, would play out in Warsaw in 1871. On the evening of Sukkot, cheery and even-minded Jewish families had sat down in their beautifully decorated huts as a mob of around 15 Christians assaulted them and beat them and kicked men, women, and children. The head of police in this 9th district angrily dismissed the complaint, claiming it to be a non-issue as nobody had been killed. The very next day, uncouth youths attacked a Jewish funeral, but this time the perpetrators were arrested. The purpose of the research project, which is the background of this conference, has been to establish a full review of anti-Jewish violences in Polish lands, and I think that when we look at the shifts which take place, the transformations which take place, we absolutely need to integrate in this interpretation these very small-scale events, which are, in my understanding, very indicative for the shifts which take place throughout the 19th century. And this is a work which actually has not really been done so far, and I commend this our project, or the project on anti-Jewish violence in Polish lands, of having undertaken this task. Based on this proposed definition of pogroms by John Clear, Darius Staliounas has now, in a very recent volume, which was just published 2 or 3 weeks ago, taken up John Clear's definition and based also on about which we heard earlier, the definition which was proposed by Werner Bergmann from the Center for Study of Antisemitism in Berlin, the following definition: a one-sided and non-governmental form of social control. This resonates with Tokarska Bakir's reflection on Sénéchal de la Roche's concept of the competitive ethnicity model, as self-help by a group that occurs when no remedy from the state against the threat which another ethnic group poses can be expected. The pogrom is different from other forms of control, such as lynching, terrorism, and vigilantism, in that the participants in such a pogrom hold the entire outgroup responsible, and therefore act against the group as a whole, and also in that it usually displays a low degree of organization. And I would like to remind you of the argument proposed by Joanna Tokarska-Bakier this morning, that we have to understand the culturally defined dimension of these riots or these outbursts. The central characteristics of the modern pogrom, as John Clear proposes to understand it, is the unexpected outbreak of violence after small. The outbreak of violence in 1881 goes back, as is well known, as established, to a tavern brawl in Elisabethgrad in the aftermath of the assassination of Tsar Alexander II. What is a central element is a high number of incidents, more than 400. I will show you a map in a second. Of more than 400 incidents between April 81 and May 1882 in 3 major waves of violences. It was violence perpetrated by the neighbors. And there are 2 recent attempts to understand this neighborly dimension of the violence. This is Tim Buchen about Galicia in 1908 and Darius Salinas about Lithuania, where this culturally defined, highly culturally defined dimension of the violence is reflected, that it is about a re-establishing of order, re-establishing of a balance. It is not, and this is very important when we think about how the term of pogrom then becomes translated and or applied to things like terror policies of the Narodowa Demokracja, or not to speak of German Nazi extermination policies. These cases of, even if these are modern pogroms, these are not pogroms which have an attempt to annihilate the neighbor, annihilate the neighboring community. It is to re-establish, as Tokarska-Bakier has explained this morning, to re-establish the good order. And it is quite fascinating to see that Professor Tokarska-Bakier and Tim Buchen and Darius Salinas in Vilnius and quite a number of other, Mirosław Sabo in Berlin, all come to the same conclusion, that it is an outburst of violence which is, but still including the idea that by committing these violences, which are morally wrong but which are necessary, something like a balance is re-established. The new quality of what happens in the 20th century, starting in the interwar period, will be quite obvious. What is important in contradistinction between 19th century occurrences of violence and with violence which starts in Chisinau in 1903 is the intermediate level of violence. In all 400 riots, anti-Jewish riots in southern Russia, there are around 40 people who get killed. 20 of them are pogromists and 20 are Jews. If you think about the number of incidents, this is an intermediate level of violence. It is not one which is putting murder at its first objective. And it did most notably occur. We talk about our Russian pogroms or Russians. It occurs in what Putin nowadays calls Novorossiya. It takes place in the southern provinces of the empire, a region which is of not long-standing Jewish residents, in contrast to the territories of a long-standing Jewish settlement where these violences are much less frequent. So these are regions where with quite a significant shift in population, demographic change as well. Okay, I will skip a couple of reflections about definition, because I really don't want to repeat what has been said before. I think that Sénéchal de la Roche's competitive ethnicity model is certainly the most and about relative deprivation is certainly the most relevant to apply for 19th century events. I think that Paul Brass Pogro's reflections about the individual responsibility of those who perpetrate the violence is something we need to take into consideration. I think we need to differentiate a bit more his understanding of the pogrom entrepreneur, of the pogrom specialist. I think this is a group which we still have to understand more completely. I would argue, not in the least based on my reading of the recent study by Tim Buchen about Galizien, that we need to understand especially the role of the mediators more precisely, the translators who translate new ideas about the enmity of the Jews, or the depravity of the Jews, or the shkodliwość of the Jews, the harmful character of the Jews in practical steps. And these are not necessarily the journalists, teachers, or preachers. These are the small functionaries. These are the people who have a certain amount of authority, but not who don't give orders. They facilitate the crossing of the line. And there's, in the 19th century, you still have a line which needs to be crossed in order to perpetrate violence. Okay. Let me see what we have here. Here we have the map. This is the map of the first 10 days of the anti-Jewish anti-Jewish violence in southern Russia. The first 30 days of more than a full year of anti-Jewish violence. If you look, I mean, I had the pleasure to put this map together. The main characteristic, I don't ask you to really study the map, it's very difficult to read, I did it myself 2 minutes ago, we always speak about waves. If you take the archival records about anti-Jewish violence in southern Russia in 1881 and 1882, you see that this is more like fireworks. It's not waves which move along smoothly. Pogroms break out or happen in a variety of unpredictable places, in a vast region. What does happen is that indeed you have a place like Smela and many other places of the type where you have one incident and you have then a spreading of incidents around it, like 5 or 6 incidents happening 1 day or 2 days or 3 days later. This is what people have often perceived as waves. But beyond that, there are no waves. It is a Jew baiting fest which lasts for a year in a variety of locations. So how come that we use the term of pogrom when we speak about the Nazi period? This is Professor Greenberg mentioned the Heb riots of 1819. Do we need a Russian word to designate anti-Jewish violence in German lands? No, we don't. We have anti-Jewish riots. I mean, this is a nice woodcut from 1819 about the Heb riots. This is a contemporary woodcut. So if you look at the scene which you see here, I mean, you could put here Elisabethgrad 1881. Nobody would have any doubt that it's correct. Also, perhaps that people are a bit nicely dressed, but never mind. This is just a riot. This is exclusionary violence. So the term of pogrom is like Kristallnacht, is a pogrom which emerges and seems to fit. So why do we speak when we look at you don't need this one. Why do we speak about a pogrom when looking at the night of the 9th to the 10th November 1938? And this is a quite far-reaching question. I show you first a map of Germany in 1933. These maps have been produced for the exhibit in the Centrum Judaicum in Berlin for the occasion of an exhibition about the Kristallnacht. And they also called it November Pogrome, by the way. And all the green dots are Jewish communities. These are the Jewish communities in the German Reich in 1933. You see, Gdańsk is not part of the Reich. It's the interwar period, and you have a lot of green dots. Now, what follows is the map of anti-Jewish violence taking place in one night. All the white dots are attacks on Jewish places of worship. Okay, what I want to say, what I want to show with these two maps, or with these three maps, is that there is a very, very significant difference between what happens in southern Russia in 1930, and what happens in Russia in 1881, 1882, and what happens in Nazi Germany in 1938. This is a qualitative difference. We are not supposed to use the same term, I would say. If you are a German Jew in 1938 and you get beaten up by a SR man and you suffer from it, you may say, whether I'm beaten by a Ukrainian peasant or an SR guy doesn't really make a difference. But for us as academics, the difference is obviously a very substantial one. We need to understand whether what happens here in this one night can be categorized, and I'm very grateful for the introduction of Professor Greenberg to what is a definition, whether we can base the use of the term pogrom on the same assumptions when we use, which we use when we look at Russia 1881-82 or Warsaw 1881, we will discuss in the afternoon. And I would argue it is not only problematic, it is really wrong. What this is, and therefore I'm especially grateful for Kami's presentation, this is terror. This is state terror. Organized state terror, as the Endecja planned, obviously, and you use the term, as the Endecja, the young Endecja in the 1930s, I mean not the whole Endecja, but the dynamic part of the Endecja, tried to emulate fascist movements across Europe and exercise terror on a specific part of the population. Did anti-Jewish violences occur in the night 9th to 10th and the following days, 1938, which were of popular or spontaneous character? Yes, there were cases which we could subsume under the term of popular anti-Jewish violence, which could even be termed with a bit of effort as a pogrom. However, this is after 5 years of authoritarian rule of the NSDAP, and it happens on the back of a concerted, centrally organized effort, and I come back to the very basic definitions which I believe are very close to the truth, of a concerted, state-based effort. So in contrast to what the pogrom in the view of the vast majority of specialists of anti-Jewish violence of the 19th century marks the absence of the state. What is, I mean, slightly problematically called self-help of the non-Jewish population in the one definition I gave you, is here the contrary. The popular violence which happens indeed in the night and in the days which follow, and the robbery, for example, is something which happens on the back of a centrally organized terrorist onslaught on the Jewish population, which has been premeditated. I don't have to go into the history of Herrscher Grünspan and the event which allowed the Nazi Germany, which seemingly allowed the Nazi regime to trigger this event, but it was part of the transition from exclusion, from discrimination to exclusion, to harassment and exclusion and annihilation. It is a very important step on the pathway to genocide. So I don't want to say in Eastern Europe this is not happening. We just heard it was happening. And it happened not only in Poland. We can look at Hungary, we can look at Lithuania. We have very similar events. So I'm not trying to protect Eastern Europe from this interpretation of anti-Jewish violence. But we should certainly be more careful when we talk about 20th century occurrences, whether the term of pogrom is legitimate. I would argue it is not, and I would plead it's a completely futile effort because the term pogrom for 1938 is so well established that it doesn't work. But I would plead that if you are thinking about this, be careful, and I would recommend not to do it because it blurs the lines and is not helpful. Thank you very much.
Any direct commentary or question now? Yeah.
Is it the case that in Austria the Jews were concentrated in a few places, or is it really true that there were very few? There were very few in Austria. There were very few attacks.
Yeah, much less. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
that was my lead up to the question. Is that because there were fewer places,
there are fewer places, but also obviously, I mean, the Anschluss is in 1938, so the direct, I mean, this would happen by telephone. What happens in this night happens by telephone and by direct instructions down the line of orders. So these are not yet
planned. It was planned.
Yes, but not in the connection to Austria was not yet established in the same way as it was throughout the empire.
Only 8 months after the action.
Yes. Yeah.
But what you are trying to show here, what is marked in white, what is the rationale here? Can you please in one sentence? Well, I didn't get it. I'm totally confused, and I'm waiting for the discussion to hear some others.
Oh, what I want to show you.
Trying to show with what?
That the Nazi regime had planned a terrorist attack on its Jewish population as a further aggravation of the persecution, and that it was an all-encompassing effort. This is why I show these two maps, because what happens in one night is a systematic attack on all places of Jewish worship. It is a symbolic, violent, terrorist exclusion of the Jewish population. And this is why the two maps are so important, because it's systematic in the sense that they went through the telephone book and said, oh, we have a synagogue here, let's burn it down.
When did they went to a telephone book? Months earlier.
Well, I mean, they had the lists, obviously.
On the night between the 9 and the 10.
No, I mean, the plan to do this is obviously drawn up, I mean, latest after Herschel Wilspan shoots the German diplomat in Paris. I mean, this is a few weeks, and I mean, then you have the expulsion of Polish Jews or stateless Jews from Germany to Poland, and I mean, no, this is leading up to the attack, obviously. And so it takes a couple of weeks to produce this effect.
Yeah.
I have just a clarification question. Your last sentence, are you making a case for not using pogrom for Kristallnacht or for interwar Poland? Because kind of when
well, we have to see we have to wait for Camille's book. I propose.
Camille is writing only on
Poland.
Województwo.
Well,
it's nothing. No,
well,
it's not Eastern.
My proposal is to speak of November Terror or Night of Terror. It's very easy. I mean, you just.
So the argument was really for November 38 in.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Last question now.
You stress, and I agree very strongly with it, that the organization part of the pogrom or non-pogrom is the key defining feature of what happened. And what fascinates me always is how do participants in this mob or collective violence, where do they know how to behave? What gives the consistency of behavior across wide space? And in this case, you can say, well, there was an order by telephone. But when you go, well, for example, to Christopher Browning and Józefów killing, local officers and soldiers didn't know how to kill the Jews. How do participants in the violence know how to behave so they behave so consistently across such a wide space?
It's archetypical culture.
I think very important difference between pogroms in Eastern Europe before World War I and this event is this happens in the night, the others happen during the day. The anti-Jewish violences in Eastern Europe of the traditional type, let's say the modern traditional type. We are, looking at a variety of things here, obviously, is something which has, as I mentioned in my introduction, has a very strong ritualistic side. We have very few views of that. I mean, people would draw up the situation. This is included in John Keel's book, where you have the bystanders, the famous bystanders. These are elegant women with umbrellas protecting their light skin from the sun while the beating is going on. In 1938, this is in the night. There are normally, this is obviously done by people of the SR, sometimes supported by simple party folk members, but the populace is not there, and where it's there, it's cordoned off. So, which is, I don't want to exculpate the German population. There's a lot going on before that and around this event, but it is a different kind of performance. It's a different kind of stage, and what is performed is a different kind of play, or not play, a different kind of drama. And I think we have to look at these details with great care, and we should not. And just a very short last remark. My colleague at UCL, Mary Fulbrook, speaks of communities of memory when she looks at the dynamic character of what is sometimes called cultural or collective memory or communicative memory. I think this is one element to it. We see exclusionary violence on a wide scale in Europe, in Eastern Europe, Central Europe. And we try to make sense of it, and trying to make sense of it, we do the opposite actually, because we apply a term which doesn't work for this. We call it pogrom, somehow exterritorializing semantically what is happening here to Eastern Europe. This is a very German thing to do. I mean, that the Germans call this pogroms is understandable. That the whole scientific community calls it a pogrom is a blunder.
Okay, thank you, Francois.